We continue now at the top of Daf Yomi Gemara in Meseches Kiddushin. This is Kiddushin Daf 5a. The Gemara says, "Uminayin shaf b'shtar." How do we know that Kiddushin can be done with a shtar? V'dinhu, we can learn it out as follows: Uma kesef she'ein motzi machnes. If kesef, which is not able to be used for divorce, can be used for Kiddushin, shtar shemotzi, so a document which can be used for divorce, eino din shemachnes. Isn't it logical to say that it can be used for Kiddushin as well? But the Gemara says, Mala Kesef, but what is unique about Kesef? Shekain Podin Bo Hektish Meiser Sheni. Kesef can be used to redeem Hektish, and it can be used to redeem Meiser Sheni, so you can't learn from Kesef. Tomar Shtar, Shein Podin Bo Hektish Meiser Sheni. On the other hand, Shtar cannot be used to redeem Hektish or Meiser Sheni. Dichsiv, as it's written, V'nasan HaKesef V'kamlo. When it talks about the redemption, it talks about giving Kesef. You have to specifically use money and not Shtar. And so the Gemara instead says, Amar Kra, the Pasuk says, V'yotza v'haisa. It says she's going to leave her first husband and then she'll go marry another husband. It's talking about divorce in the Psukim. Makesh havoya liyitzia. The Pasuk is comparing the havoya, the Kiddushin, to the yitzia, to the divorce. Ma yitzia b'shtar, just like the divorce happens with a shtar. Af havoya nami b'shtar, that's the source. Havoya also, that's the source that Kiddushin can also be done with a shtar. V'yakesh nami yitzia lahavoya. But the Gemara says, let's compare also. We should compare the other direction. Let's compare Yitzia to Havoya. Ma Havoya b'kesef, af Yitzia b'kesef. We should say that just like Kiddushin can be done with kesef, so to the divorce should be done with kesef. If we're going to make the comparison in one direction, we should make the comparison in the other direction. And the Gemara says, Amar Abaya says, Yomru kesef machnes kesef motzi. Then people will say the same money that was used to bring her into the marriage, that's the same money that's used to bring her out of the marriage. Sanegor yasa kategor. Should the defender become the accuser? That can't be. But the Gemara says, fine, if you're going to make that argument, if so, shtar nami. When it comes to shtar also, yomru shtar motzi shtar machnas, people will say the same thing. The same shtar that's using for divorce can also be used for kiddushin. Kategor yasa sanegor, can the accuser become the defender? And the Gemara says to that, by shtar it's not a problem, even though by kesef it cannot be. The kesef is used for both kiddushin and also for gerushin because of the issue of kategor yasa sanegor, so or sanegor yasa kategor. So that's true by kesef. But when it comes to shtara, mili dahai shtara lechud or mili dahai shtara lechud, the words that are in this shtar are unique, and the words that are in that shtar are unique. Meaning the shtar for kiddushin has one text, and the shtar for gerushin has a different text. So it's not a problem. You don't make the argument of kategor yasa sanegor. Hachanami, so the Gemara says, what do you mean? Here also, why don't we say, Hai kasba l'chud, vai kasba l'chud? It's different money. Here you're using one piece of money, and over here you're using a different piece of money. But the Gemara says to that, tiva miachadhu, but it's all the same imprint. It's all the same basic. The money itself all looks the same. That's not the same as by shtar, where it has a completely different text. And the Gemara continues, Rava says, Amar Kra, the Pasuk says, V'chasav lo, it says he's going to write for her when it's talking about the divorce, and we understand that to mean, B'chsiva miskareshes, that the woman can be divorced with ksiva, with a document, Ve'ena miskareshes b'kesef, but she cannot be miskareshes b'kesef with money. In other words, we do make a comparison between the Kiddushin and the Gerushin. That's from the Pasuk of V'yotza v'haisa. And since we compare the two, therefore we understand that just like the divorce, just like the Gerushin is with a shtar, so too Kiddushin is with a shtar. And the question of we should make the comparison in the other direction and say that just like the Kiddushin can be with kesef, so too the Gerushin can be with kesef, that we don't say. We learn from the Chasav law that only b'chsiva miskareshes, only with a document is a woman divorced and not with kesef. But the Gemara says, Ve'ema, why don't we say as follows? B'chsiva miskareshes, that she's divorced with a document, Ve'ena miskadeshes b'chsiva, and Kiddushin cannot be done with a document. Maybe we should darshan b'chasav law in that fashion. And the Gemara says, no, haksiv v'yatza v'haisa. We already know there's a comparison of v'yatza v'haisa, makish v'chulu. When we compare the two, we understand that just like a document works for gerushin, so too it does work for kiddushin. And the Gemara says, Umar Ra'isa. But the Gemara says, well, how do you know which way to darshan the psukim? How do you know when we say to include something and when we say not to include something? And the Gemara says to that, mistabra, it makes sense. Koi begerushin. If the pasuk v'chasav law is talking about gerushin, mimayit gerushin, that it's excluding gerushin, meaning it's saying v'chasav law when it comes to gerushin, a document is effective and not kesef. That makes sense. Koi begerushin umemayit Kiddushin, the pasuk that's discussing gerushin is going to exclude Kiddushin. Does it make sense to say that the pasuk means to say a document is effective for gerushin and a document is not effective for Kiddushin? That doesn't make sense. But the Gemara continues with Rabbi Yossi Haglili. But what about according to Rabbi Yossi Haglili? The apik leilahai kro ledrosha achrina. He uses this pasuk for something else. Rashi over here says, according to Rabbi Yossi Haglili, the mapik leilahai v'chosav. He uses the pasuk of v'chosav ledrosha achrina for something else. That's beparak beis de Gittin. That's in the second parak of Gittin. Rabbi Yossi Haglili uses v'chosav for something else. So if we use it for something else, she'ena miskareshes bekesav menoli. We're back to that question. How do we know that kesef cannot be used for gerushin? And for that, we could have another source. Amar Kra, the pasuk says sefer krisus. It calls the get a sefer krisus, a document of separation. Sefer korsa ve'ein davar acher korsa. We learn from that only a document, only a shtar can be used for gerushin and nothing else. That's where Rabbi Yossi Haglili will learn that halacha. The Rabbanan, and according to the Rabbanan, Hai Krisus my Avdile, what do they do with that pasuk of Sefer Krisus? Miboili, they use it for the following halacha: Ledavar hakores beino leveina, that a gerushin has to be something that completely separates him from her. Kedetani, as we learned in a braysa, Hareza gitech al menashelo tishti yayin. If he says to his wife, "This is your get on condition you don't drink wine," al menashelo telchi levei savich, on the condition you don't go to your father's house. Liolam, if he makes these conditions forever, then it's not really, she's never really separated from him. She's always attached to him through these conditions. So ein zeh krisus, that's not called cutting her off. That's not a proper gerushin. Kol shloshim yom, but if he just says these conditions are in effect for 30 days, harei zeh krisus, that is considered to be krisus. That's considered to be a proper separation. That's what the Rabbanan do with the pasuk of Sefer Krisus. Rabbi Yossi Haglili, where does he learn out this halacha that it has to be davar hakores beino leveina, that it has to be a total separation? So he learns that mikores krisus kanafkale, because it could have said the word kores and then it says the word krisus. So it's actually not only is the whole term extra, but also the way it's phrased is extra. It didn't have to say the word krisus. It could have said kares instead. But the Rabbanan respond to that. Kares krisus lo mashmalu. They don't make a drasha out of the fact that instead of saying krisus, it could have said kares. That they don't make a drasha. And the Gemara continues, Chada mechada lo asya. So we understand now, you can't learn one kind of Kiddushin from another, but Teisi chada mitarti. Why can't we learn out one from two of them, from a combination, what we call a tzad hashove? Why can't we use a tzad hashove to learn out Kiddushin by one of the other ones? Rashi explains as follows. The Gemara's question is as follows. Haitana de le'el, de parach bekulu. The Tana before always had a question on every single kind of limud. V'halo dinhu v'hadar de lo asumidina. Try to learn it out from somewhere, then say it can't be learned out from there. V'yatzur chekra, and that's why you always needed a pasuk. Lamali kra bekulu, but now the Gemara is asking, do we really need a pasuk? Why do we need a pasuk for everything? Nihi de chada mechada lo asya. Granted, we can't learn out one from one, because there's always some way to refute and say that this one is different than that one. But teisei chad mitarti, why not learn from one from two of them? Because we can say that there's a common denominator between two of them. Shekon and bialma, that in general they create kinyanim, v'kon and kan, and they work over here as a kinyan in terms of kiddushin. Afani avias ashlishi, so too over here. Let's bring the third case. Shari kulam konim b'makom acher, because everything is, all of these things can create kinyanim in other contexts. For example, kesef ishtar konim b'omo hevriya. Both kesef and shtar can be konim by an omo hevriya, by the maidservant, kedel kamon, like we say later. Bia kona biyavama, and bia can be kona by yavama. So they all have certain types of kinyanim. So again, why can't we learn out one of them from two of them in terms of the kiddushin? That's the Gemara's question. And so the Gemara says, again, teisi chad mitarti, why can't we learn out one from two of them? And the Gemara says, hey, Tasi, well, which one are we learning out? Lo lichtov rachmana b'shtar. Let's say the Torah didn't write anything in terms of shtar. There was no source that shtar could be for Kiddushin. V'teisi mehanach, and you'll say, we'll learn out shtar from the other two. We'll learn out shtar from kesef and bia, just like kesef and bia. They create kinyanim in other contexts, and they create kinyanim for Kiddushin. So too shtar, which creates a kinyan in other contexts, so too it can create the kinyan for Kiddushin. But no, malahanoch shekain hana'asan meruba. But what's unique about kesef and bia is that they give great pleasure. By kesef, it can make a person rich. When it comes to bia, so there's a physical pleasure, and so therefore you can't learn out shtar from those two. And so the Gemara then says, well, lo nechtov rachmon b'bia, let the pasuk not write anything by bia, v'teisei mehanach, and let's learn out bia from kesef and shtar. But the Gemara says, no, malahanoch shekein kinyonan meruba. When it comes to kesef and shtar, there are many kinds of kinyonim you can make with money and with shtaros. As Rashi says, for example, karka, avodim, and so therefore you can't necessarily learn out bia from kesef and and shtar. And then the Gemara says, Lo nichtov rachmana bekesef, so maybe the pasuk shouldn't write anything about kesef being used for Kiddushin. V'teisem Hanach, and kesef can be learned out from bia and shtar. But malahanach shekein yeshnan bal karcha, but what's unique about shtar and what's unique about bia is that they can work against the other person's will. Meaning by yibam, for example, bia can work against, bal karcha can work against the will of the yavama. And by shtar also can be used for gerushin against the will of the wife. And so therefore that's unique. You can't necessarily learn out kesef from there. V'chitema kesef nami, and maybe you'll say that kesef also, bal karcha, there is a case of kesef against her will. B'yam ha'ivriya, because in Amma ha'ivriya, maidservant, her father sells her against her will, and that's with kesef. But the Gemara says to that, be'ishus miolo eshkachan, but we don't find that in terms of situations of marriage. That's a case of servitude. It's a monetary situation. Therefore, we don't find in any situation of marriage, of ishus, that we see kesef being used against her will. And the Gemara continues at the two dots. Amar Rav Huna says, Chuppah kona mikal v'chomer. Chuppah can create a kinyan from a kal v'chomer. Meaning, chuppah we know, and there's a machlokes rishonim exactly what chuppah is. Is it going under the canopy, going into seclusion? That's a separate machlokes. But Rav Huna is saying over here that chuppah can be used for kiddushin from the following kal v'chomer. Now we know that chuppah is used for the nisuin, for the final stage of the marriage. Rav Huna is saying it can even be used for kiddushin from the following kal v'chomer. Uma kesef she'eno machil b'truma kona. If kesef, when you use kesef for kiddushin, that does not allow her to eat truma. Rashi says, "Kesef she'eno machil b'truma im nisarsa l'kohen." If a woman is betrothed to a kohen, kedetanan b'chsuva seino isha chelas b'truma at shetikonis l'chuppah. It says in the Mishnah in Ksubas, a wife does not eat truma until she enters the chuppah. So we understand that by kesef, which does not allow her to eat truma, kona, that creates the kinyan kiddushin. Chuppah, when it comes to chuppah shemacheles b'truma, which allows her to eat truma, that's already like the level of nisuin. Einodin shetikna, certainly it should create the kinyan, it should create a kiddushin. But the Gemara says, 1 second, that's not even true. The kesef eino machil, is it really true that kesef does not allow the wife to eat truma? V'amarula, Barula said Dvar Torah that on a doraisa level, arusa bas Yisrael ocheles b'truma. If you have a woman that just has kiddushin and she's a bas Yisrael and she has kiddushin, she has erusin with a kohen, she does eat truma. Shenemar, as it says in the pasuk, v'choen ki yikn nefesh kinyan kaspo. It says it has to be a kinyan, it has to be an acquisition. V'hai kinyan kaspo, and the erusin is also considered kinyan kaspo. And so therefore, really on a doraisa level, it's not true. Kesef does allow a woman to have truma. And what's the reason why we say that if a woman is an arusa, bas Yisrael, she can't have truma? That's just a gezeira, it's just a decree. Because while she's an arusa, she's still living in her father's house. Maybe she'll end up pouring a cup in the house of her father of truma. She'll give it to her brother and her sisters. In other words, there's just a concern that her family members who are not allowed to have truma, she'll give them the truma. She'll give them a cup of wine that's truma. And so that's the only reason it's a gezeira midrabanan. But really, when it comes to kesef, it does have the ability to allow the bas Yisrael to have truma, and so you can't make the kal v'chomer. You can't say that just like kesef, which is not machel b'truma, is kona, so to chuppah, which is machelos b'truma, it's not a good kal v'chomer. And so the Gemara instead says, Ela parachachi, rather ask as follows, Uma kesef she'eno gomer kona. If kesef, which does not finish the kinyan, but it can create the initial kinyan of kiddushin, meaning it doesn't create nisuin, but it creates kiddushin. Rashi says, she'eno gomer lahotzia me rishus aviyah. What it means to say is, it doesn't take her totally out from the rishus of her father, l'maisa yodeh, in terms of her earnings, uli yerushasan, in terms of inheriting her. So it doesn't do that, but it's able to create this kinyan, and we will continue with this discussion in the next video on Daf Hey Amud Beis.